The year is 1509. The League of Cambrai, representing the total combined power of Western Europe, is called upon by the papacy to crush Venice. At the Battle of Agnadello, the Venetian forces are completely destroyed. France is poised to invade the very islands that comprise Venice to deliver the coup de grace. The papacy relents. They fear a war that will be fought on Italian soils by foreign troops. Several times before, such troops had seized part of Italy. In a series of diplomatic maneuvers, the alliance falls apart, and miraculously, Venice is saved. Venice, which worked with the Turks to create a republic of usury and slavery. Venice, whose banking houses of Bardi and Peruzzi brought the Black Death which depopulated 2/3 of Europe. Venice, the slave traders of Europe, so close to being destroyed, survived. Its survival would now wreak havoc on Western civilization. Modern history commences with Nicholas of Cusa and the Italian Renaissance that Cusa and his collaborators inspired. It was Cusa, with the help of Pius II, that created the basis for a war on the pagan idea of man as a beast and to defend the concept of man as Imago Dei and Capax Dei. It was the power of these ideas which caused the greatest increase in human population in the history of man. This idea of the power of hypothesis and its relationship to transforming nature proved conclusively that man was fundamentally different from the beast and as such could not be used as a slave. Venice reacted wildly against the ascendancy of this idea. With the papacy and the firm grip of Pius II and Cusa, Venice launches a war to destroy Christianity. The figure of Gasparo Contarini is the key one for Venice in their war. Contarini was trained at Padua University. He was the son of one of the oldest families in Venice. It was said of him that he was so versed in Aristotle that if all of Aristotle was lost, he could reproduce it in its entirety. He learned his Aristotle in Padua under the direction of Pietro Pomponazzi. Every Venetian oligarchical family sent their children to Padua University to become trained as Aristotelians. To understand Venice, you must understand Aristotle. He is pure evil and has been so since the time he wrote his diatribe against the method of Plato approximately 2,300 years ago. Since Aristotle is almost unreadable, you must ask the question, what is it about Aristotle that has made his writing so influential in Western civilization? Aristotle is a thoroughgoing defense of oligarchical society. In his Politics, Aristotle is most explicit. His theory of the purpose of politics is to maintain inequality. The state must carry on this natural idea and maintain it. The very basis for Aristotle's Politics is the maintenance of the master-slave relationship because it is, as he asserts, most natural. Quote, that one should command and another obey is both necessary and expedient. Indeed, some things are so divided right from birth, some to rule, some to be ruled. It is clear then that by nature some are free and others are slaves, and that for these it is both just and expedient that they should serve as slaves. One could accuse me of taking quotes out of context, but this would be false. It is true even Plato makes a case for slavery, but unlike Aristotle, Plato bases his state on the idea of justice. Just compare Aristotle's Politics with Plato's Republic, where Plato from the very beginning launches a diatribe against arbitrary power. In the Thrasymachus section of the dialogue, he proves that the very basis for the Republic is a universal idea, that only universal ideas are fundamentally causal. The idea for Plato's Republic, as he shows, must be based on a concept of the good. Since Aristotle is functioning within a philosophical environment created by Plato, he cannot throw out the concept of universals altogether. What he does instead is assign them to the realm of vita contemplativa. Since they are not known by the senses, we can only have faith in their existence. Contrast that to Plato, in which the idea of the good and justice are causal, not contemplative and unknowable. These innate ideas, which in another dialogue by Plato proves that by showing a slave with these ideas, are the very basis for his republic. It is clear the reason that Aristotle was so widely influential in Venice is that Venice was a slave society based on a principle of oligarchism. Renaissance Christianity is the antithesis of this bestial conception. For Venice and Contarini, this Christian idea of man and the rejection of slavery and usury called their very existence into question, and they reacted with cold, hard evil in defense of their way of life. This is Gasparo Contarini. Contarini's Aristotelianism was highlighted by his early writings when he asserts, quote, "And in truth, I understand that even if I did all the penance I could, and more, it would not suffice in the least to merit happiness or even render satisfaction for past sins. Truly, I have arrived at the firm conclusion that nobody can become justified through his own works or cleansed from the desires of his own heart." He also, in another letter, calls man a worm. Radical Protestantism and Contarini's Catholicism are the Aristotelian split between vita contemplativa, faith, and vita activa, works. Aristotelianism is both the hatred of God and man. It is unbelievable that there is no difference between him, Contarini, and Luther. Yet Contarini and several other Venetian noblemen later dominate the Reform Commission, which nominally prosecutes a war on the Reformation. This statement by Contarini was the essence of the spirituality movement that was to dominate a section of the most powerful Venetian oligarchy. Let us look now briefly at Contarini's career to understand how critical he is to Venice. Contarini was Venice's ambassador to the papacy. At another time, he was the ambassador to the court of Charles V. He profiles both Charles V and the papacy. He is next appointed to the Council of Ten, which is the leading body of the Venetian state, and later to the Council of Three, which is the supreme ruling body of Venice. This council is justice in Venice. It ruled on all cases and could order assassinations from which there was no reprieve. This is how Venice kept control of its oligarchical families. What is striking is from the Council of Three, Contarini was appointed a cardinal. As a cardinal, he was first asked to create the Reform Commission for the Council of Trent. He and 4 other spiritualities dominate the commission. He was next appointed to negotiate with the Lutherans at Regensburg at the behest of the Habsburg Emperor Charles V in 1541. At Regensburg, he gives away the Venetian game. Contarini, in what was to be called Article 5, reiterates his Lutheran beliefs. It is a bit of an embarrassment that Calvin praises Article 5 at Regensburg. This is Calvin now. "You will marvel when you read Article 5 that our adversaries have conceded so much. Nothing is to be found in it that does not stand in our own writings." Then, in typical Venetian fashion, Contarini creates an Aristotelian Phidias faction inside the church, which insists that the only thing that separates Protestants from Catholics would be now reduced fundamentally to the question of the magisterium. He is later reprimanded by the Pope. It can now be stated what happened to the Renaissance. Venice manipulates both the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, leading to a series of wars which drowns the Renaissance legacy of Cusa and Pius in a sea of blood that culminates in the 30 Years' War. This war depopulates most of Europe. It sets up the basis for an onslaught against Christianity, much as the cultural pessimism that dominated Europe after World War I. This Venetian evil was now to descend on England. What was Venice's strategic objective? It is now 1520. According to their profile of the Spanish Habsburgs, the major vulnerability of the Habsburgs had been the strategic shipping lanes through the English Channel. Spain needs the Netherlands for massive tax revenue that these holdings brought in order to maintain the Spanish army. The problem was the Spanish were also very much aware of the strategic need to have good relations with England, and the Habsburg monarchy married Catherine to Henry VIII to ensure such an alliance. For Venice to succeed, Henry had to be broken from Spain. How was this accomplished and through whom? The Venetian faction in England got the upper hand when Henry VIII fell for the sexual bait of that faction put before him, Anne Boleyn. Anne was the granddaughter of the leader of the Venetian faction in England, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, of the powerful Howard family. The Howards continued to be agents of Venetian influence for a very long time, and may be still so to this day, even though they were occasionally the victims of it. Other families, such as the Russells, Herberts, the Cavendishes, also become consistent carriers of the Venetian virus. Henry's insistence upon the divorce from Catherine of Aragon and the remarriage to Anne entailed the fall of his chief minister, Cardinal Wolsey. Wolsey knew very well what evil Venice represented, and at least on one occasion told the Venetian ambassador to his face. In Wolsey's place emerged a technocrat of the Venetian faction, Thomas Cromwell, who had learned the Venetian system while working in Venice as an accountant to a Venetian well-known to the leading spirituality, Reginald Pole. Cromwell effectively ran the English government in the 1530s until his own fall and execution in the 1540s. Cromwell had cultivated those humanists who were favorable to the break with Rome, and a, quote, little Padua came to be developed around one of these figures at Cambridge University by the name of Thomas Smith. Smith returned from Padua to become the head of Cambridge in 1544. He is best known for a book on English government which asserts that kings were too powerful. Other leading figures of this little Padua were Roger Ascham, John Cheek, and William Cecil. This was a tightly knit group. They were the tutors of the Protestant children of Henry VIII, Edward and Elizabeth. At this point, we must add the infamous Francesco Zorzi. Zorzi is a Venetian sex counselor for Henry VIII. It was Zorzi that rendered Venice's official pronouncement that through his reading of the ancient Hebrew text, that the Pope did not have the right to grant the dispensation for Henry to marry Catherine. Therefore, according to Venice, Henry never truly married Catherine. For Henry, this sealed the alliance with Venice against Spain and unleashed his own ambitions. How explicit the Venetians are on the question of how explicit this faction was on the question of Venice is identified by Thomas Starkey, who was a spirituality who traveled through Venice with Reginald Pole. Okay. To identify the importance of Pole, he is a Plantagenet, who is possibly one of the claimants to the English throne. Pole later becomes the chief advisor to Mary Tudor, who reigns in England after Henry VIII. Previously, Pole had also almost been elected Pope. Starkey becomes one of Thomas Cromwell's chief spies. In a fictional dialogue between Thomas Lupsit and Reginald Pole, Starkey states, "For this cause, the most wise men, considering the nature of princes and the nature of man as it is indeed, affirm a mixed state to be of all others the best and most convenient, to conserve the whole out of tyranny. For as in Venice is no great ambitious desire to be their duke, because he is restrained to order and politics, So with us also should be our king, if his power were tempered after the manner before described. This tightly knit group of Venetian Aristotelians organized Henry's break with Rome. It was this break which opens England for the Venetian operations. The second phase of the Venetian operations were much more devastating. This second phase was launched by the notorious Paolo Sarpi. It is in this phase that England's mind and soul are taken, and England is set up to become the bastion of the new age it has become. To understand this, you must understand the mind of Paolo Sarpi and who in Venice deploys him. This phase was highlighted by what was understood in Venetian history as the 1580s fight between the Giovani, the young houses, and the Vecchi, the old houses. In this phase, a very radical faction takes over. The Giovani realized that time had run out for the islands of Venice. They were increasingly less viable as a military force. For the Giovani, the only defense of Venice had to be a desperate attempt to destroy the papacy and the Habsburgs by securing Germany for the Protestants with the help of France. The Vecchi, it should be understood, wanted to control the papacy and stay within the neutralized Catholic Church, or a neutralized Catholic Church. As we see, the Giovani organize the Protestant rebellion and want to see the destruction of even the name of Christianity. Further, the plan that evolved was to move part of the money from the massive funds in the vaults of the Church of St. Mark to the Dutch Calvinist Republic Holland and England. For this phase, the takeover of England was left to Paolo Sarpi. Sarpi was nominally a Servite monk who was exceptionally talented, yet he is much more. He is the leading organizer of the Giovani. Out of the Giovani salons and secret society, Venice plans the destruction of Christianity in what was to later to be called Freemasonry. In a book about Sarpi, a modern historian by the curious name Wooten proves that Sarpi was the creator of empiricism and taught Francis Bacon his so-called scientific method. The thesis of this book, which the author proves conclusively, is that Sarpi, while nominally a Catholic monk, revealed himself in his philosophical works to be a radical atheist. Sarpi was to argue that the idea of the need for providential religion as the basis for the majority of men acting morally was unnecessary. He insisted that the belief in God was irrational, since it is not necessary to explain the existence of the physical universe by the act of creation. This is the empiricism of Bacon. It was later revealed by sources that Sarpi was a homosexual and a blasphemer who believed the Bible was just some fantastic stories. He especially attacked the idea that Moses was given the Ten Commandments from God. Since one could be burned for these ideas and beliefs, he never published his philosophical writings. Some of you may be aware of the phrase, the Pope is the Antichrist. It was Paolo Sarpi that created that myth. He is the real founder of modernism and the Enlightenment. With these ideas, he creates a pagan cult later called Freemasonry, which dominates England to this day. Out of this salon comes Giordano Bruno, Galileo, which is a complicated case, the creation of the Rosicrucian cult, and the 30 Years' War. How was this phase done? The story begins with an interdict by the Pope against Venice in 1606. This dispute was nominally about two jurisdictional matters, respecting the right of Rome to try two accused prelates and a question of the right to collect money in Venice. Venice retained Paolo Sarpi as their defender. In this fight, Sarpi wrote pamphlet after pamphlet defending of the rights of the state against that of the papacy. Henry Wooten, the ambassador from England to Venice, sent all of Sarpi's writings back to England immediately to be translated. In the course of this fight, Sarpi became the most famous man in Europe. The papacy ended the interdict without achieving its ends. In the ensuing days after the interdict was lifted, an assassin tried to kill Sarpi, but he survived. The attempt was laid at the papacy's doorstep, and now Sarpi was a hero in England and throughout Europe. He had faced down the papacy and survived. Sarpi immediately launches a thoroughgoing attack on the very existence of the church in two works called The History of the Benefices and his most famous work of his career, The History of the Council of Trent. Later, this book was dedicated to James I of England and was first published in England. It is ironic that Sarpi organized the radical Protestant opposition throughout Europe, but after all, it is Venice. Sarpi also is introduced by circles around Wooton to Francis Bacon, who corresponds with him. Bacon picks up Sarpi's writings on method from Sarpi's Arte de Ben Pensiere, where he insists that the only way an individual can know anything is through the senses. With this, modern empiricism is launched, which later becomes radical nominalism of Hume. The Giovani very consciously had to build up their own faction among the English nobility. England had to be totally controlled. The drawback that the Giovani had to correct was the fact that England was not really reliable, because the king tended to be able to act independently of Venetian strategic considerations. The way the Giovani functioned was by the creation of a Protestant-controlled merchant class. This was the most explicit in the creation of the Venice Company by the Earl of Leicester. Leicester was the founder of the Puritan movement in England. It was he who was granted by Venice certain trading routes. In 1581, another trading company had created the Venetian agreement called the Turkey Company. These two companies later merged to become the Levant Company, which later becomes the infamous British East India Company. The first governor of the East India Company was Thomas Smith, who studied law at Padua. Through this process of creating a merchant class predominantly Puritan, Venice also creates a battering ram against the king. These radical Protestant cults take over England during the so-called Commonwealth period. While England takes some 80 more years to complete the Venetian takeover, the empire of the mind is ensconced in England irreparably. Sarpi and Venice create the Rosicrucian cult of syncretic religion that becomes Freemasonry. Once that process of takeover is complete, England becomes the bastion of paganism, usury, and slavery. In short, Aristotelian. This hatred of Imago Dei is the basis of England's promotion of the New Age. This was Sarpi's program and intention. This completes the essential destruction of the English soul. Venice and Venetian methods had transplanted themselves in England.